said it will boost the enforcement capacity of local authorities by introducing COVID marshals. But after months of not being able to freely see family and friends, how will people react to returning to stricter measures? I'm joined by the former leader of the Department of Health and Social Care Behavioural Science team, Dan Berry. Hello to you, Dan. At the time at which lockdown was announced back in March, the government was quite surprised by the compliance from the public. People responded to it much better than they had expected. More people stayed at home. We're now going back into restrictions, limiting the numbers of social contacts we have. How do you think people will respond this time around?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister acknowledged in his statement yesterday that the advice, particularly on social distancing, had become quite complicated. And you don't need to be a behavioural science expert to know that as things become more complicated, it becomes harder to, play by the rules, even if you intend to. So I think the changes announced yesterday, this rule of six, for example, is broadly a good thing. My reflection on that, and my worry looking ahead to next week, though, is that what we might see in maybe an advert or on the podium at number 10 Downing Street might be quite different to what we see with our own eyes, as we walk past a busy pub, say, or a school classroom which has clearly more than 6 children. We might think, hang on a second, what are the rules for me? What has changed? So I think there's more to do to explain the reasons behind those exemptions to people so that we know the overall message, but we can see how it applies to us, including those exemptions to the main rule.
Yeah, because with those exemptions, we can go to work, we can get on a train to travel to work, our children can go to school and sit in a classroom. We can't take them to see grandparents, for example, and some people will push back and say, well, how can that be right? How can that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a stereotype of Brits that we have a very strong sense of fairness. We like to play by the rules and we don't respond all that well when other people don't. And in fact, the stereotype's born by lots of good evidence from psychology. And in fact, it's not just for Brits, but we have this sense of playing fairly. And one of the problems with, I think it's an inevitable problem with announcing increases to the restrictions yesterday, is that we shine a light on the people who don't play by the rules. So maybe groups of young kids who are hanging out together in big groups, like on the images here. Whereas actually, many of us are playing by the rules. I think rates of wearing face coverings are higher than they've ever been in the country. I think we see this when we travel on the train and in supermarkets. So what we might inadvertently get is, by shining a light on the problems, which clearly there are some, that may encourage the rest of us who are playing fair say, well, why should I bother so much? So maybe we need to counter the bad behaviour with some shining a light on more of that good behaviour that a lot of us do actually stick to ourselves and we see in our communities.
Yeah, I wonder as well if people are seeing others not following the rules when they are sticking to them themselves and we feel this feeling of unfairness. What do we do about it? Do we become the neighbour that picks up the phone and reports them?
Well, we may do, and we may see in particular tailored scenarios coming up that people do need to take some more action. I mean, something that worries me looking to later this month is hundreds of thousands of students going off to university, perhaps for the first time. And I'm sure many of us, when we were at university or got kids at university, we know about freshers' flu. And of course, the symptoms of colds and flus, look a lot like COVID-19. So you have to isolate. I understand the government's advice, which I'm not questioning, is if that is the case for you, you should stay where you are, stay in your halls of residence or in your shared house, rather than return back to your family home. But that's really difficult because it goes against so much of how parents want to look after their kids and how if we're feeling a bit rotten, we want to be looked after. So I think some of it, as well as policing, is some special support for these instances, really designed around those particular challenges, like we'll see with students off to university soon.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, and actually it could be a very isolated environment for somebody who's in halls of residence, newly away from home and unwell or having to self-isolate for various reasons. What about the future and how long this might go on for? Professor Chris Whitty was asked about this, and he said we need to think of this as a block of time. It won't just be a few weeks. it might not be many months. The Prime Minister trying to give a bit of hope with the mass testing. How much do people need something to aim towards, some light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, I think we certainly do. Some of the changes that have been asked of people, like social distancing, the new rule of six, or wearing face coverings, these are quickly being ingrained into many of our habits. So we might not really like wearing a face covering, but it's something that we now own some face masks. I keep one in my pocket all the time. So these things can go on, and they might not become more difficult. But of course, other aspects, especially when it affects people's jobs, their studies, then that does become harder. So I could totally see this might challenge people, and therefore we need to keep reinvigorating how we motivate people to do the right things for themselves and the right things for those around them.
And that motivation, I suppose, becomes more important the longer this goes in for, because you get the sense that fatigue has already well and truly set in. People got a taste of freedom over the summer. Is it harder to then go backwards than it was to enter it into the first place?
Yeah, I think it depends. This term behavioural fatigue has been used a lot, including by the very good behavioural scientists who are advising government. It includes lots of things. So fatigue might include people becoming lonely and frustrated. Might also include, the impacts on people's livelihoods and their entire lives. So if we unpick that, some of those might become easier as people develop new habits, and some of them could become harder, particularly the effects on people's livelihood.
And what about compliance? It is now legally enforceable with a fine or even a sentence. But we also have COVID marshals who'll be patrolling our towns and our villages and our streets. How well do you think people will respond to someone who isn't a police officer telling them what they can and can't do?
I think observing people's behaviour since way back in March is that public behaviour has often been a step ahead of the actual regulations. So many of us started routinely working from home before that became a requirement, and some parents started taking their kids out of school before. Same with face masks. They were already becoming common in shops and supermarkets before they were policed, essentially. So clearly policing and enforcement through whatever routes is part of the way we motivate behaviour, but there are all sorts of other impacts on people's sort of psychological responses that also motivate people that don't need to get into the policing as such. Like we take positive cues from what we see other people do, and we're also highly motivated to protect other people. So I think there's a lot of merit in keep pushing those messages. Wash your hands regularly to protect other people. And the policing side is an addition. It needn't be the only focus to get that behaviour change that we need to sustain.
Yeah, I suppose then that phrase, don't kill your gran, that we've heard from the Health Secretary, playing into that desire to protect others. Dan Berry, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts this afternoon.